Гарри Кимович, здравствуйте.
Hello, Gary.
Приветствую.
Hello.
Я рада вас слышать, рада вас видеть у
I'm
нас в
very happy
эфире.
to see you and
И
to
начну
see
я,
you on our
пожалуй, с
stream. And I would like to start
анализа статьи, которая вышла
with an
недавно в The
analysis
Economist,
of the
о
article that
том,
was
что вот
published in The
буквально
Economist.
цитирую их, Путин, похоже,
And I
побеждает в
quote,
войне с
"It
Украиной, по
seems that
крайней
Putin
мере,
is
пока.
winning in the
Статья
war against
большая,
Ukraine.
аналитическая,
At
интересная, в
least
том
it looks
числе,
like that. It's a big
ну,
article,
они
analytical,
раскладывают,
very
какие сейчас, в
interesting.
каком состоянии российская
And they
армия, в каком
analyze
состоянии
the state of
украинская
the Russian
армия.
army
Особое
and the Ukrainian
внимание они
army.
уделяют там помощи
And they
Запада
particularly focus on
Украине. И, по сути,
support
говорят о
of
том, что
Ukraine
Запад помогает
by the West. And
недостаточно,
they say
и
that this
нужно уже
support is not
выходить из этого
sufficient.
летаргического
And it's
сна. Ну,
time to
слушайте,
wake up,
практически 2 года большой
stop being
широкомасштабной
lethargic.
войны.
It has
Скажите,
been almost 2
пожалуйста, вот
years
как
of
вы
this
считаете,
full-scale
какая
war.
сейчас
So,
ситуация?
what do you think the situation is today?
Война вообще вещь
The
малопредсказуемая,
war
но тем не менее
is
есть
quite an
объективные
unpredictable
факторы,
thing,
которые
yet
можно и нужно
there are some
анализировать.
objective factors that must be
Мне кажется,
analyzed.
было бы не
And
совсем
I
верно
think it wouldn't
делать
be
вывод,
quite right to
что
make a
Путин
conclusion
выигрывает из того, что
that
писал
Putin is
«Экономист».
winning in
В
this war
целом,
based
я
on
думаю,
what The
что статья
Economist
«Экономиста»
wrote. I
указывает
think
на
that
то,
the
что
article
ситуация для Путина стала
indicates
лучше, чем она
that the
была, скажем,
situation
полгода
for
назад.
Putin
То
is
есть
much
это
better
скорее
today
всего
than it
речь
was
идет о
6 months
тренде.
ago.
Потому что
They're
линия
talking
фронта
more
пока
about
же
trends
не
here
меняется.
because the front line
Но
didn't
учитывая те
change.
ожидания, которые у всех были
Given the
перед началом
expectations that
украинского
everybody had
контрнаступления,
before the
то
beginning
понятно,
of
что на
the
сегодняшний
counteroffensive of the
день
Ukrainian
вот
army,
наши
it's
надежды не
clear that
оправдались.
as of today, our
Путинская армия в принципе
expectations were
удержала
not
основные
met.
рубежи. И
Putin's
также, что
army is
очень
still
важно,
holding
экономисты
the main
уделяют
line,
внимание,
and also
путинская экономика, она не
they
то, что не
also
рухнула,
indicated that
она уже
Putin's economy
приспособилась к
didn't
санкциям,
fall.
и на
It
сегодняшний
actually
день выпуск
adapted to
военной
the
продукции в
sanctions,
России, он, в общем,
and
налажен.
today the
Российская
production
экономика
of weaponry in
милитаризуется,
Russia is pretty
и
much set
поэтому,
up.
если
Russian
сравнивать
economy
объективную
is
ситуацию, то, скажем,
militarized, and if
тренд,
we
который
look at the situation objectively,
начал складываться
the
к лету
trend that was
22 года,
formed
который
in the
привел
summer
к
of
победам украинской армии
2022,
в августе
and we
22
saw
года,
victories
и потом
of
как
the
бы
Ukrainian
заставил
army in the
российскую армию
August
перейти
and in
к
September of
обороне, и,
2022,
в общем,
and
ожидание
it
вот
made
успешного
a
наступления,
Russian
и уже
army
там
to
строились
go
планы вообще
on
выхода к
defensive,
Азовскому морю, там отрезание Крыма
and
там,
there
и
were
так далее.
plans of Ukrainians to go
Совершенно
to the
очевидно,
Azov
что все
Sea
это
and to
вкупе с тем,
Crimea.
что санкции не
All
дают
this
даже
all
близко
together
желаемого
shows
эффекта,
us that the sanctions
ну,
don't
как бы
give
предоставляет
us
нам
what we
картину, которую
expected. They are
экономисты
not
очень объективно
effective.
оценивают.
And we see a
Вопрос,
picture
почему это
that is
происходит? Ну,
objectively
конечно, в первую очередь
evaluated
связано
by The Economist.
с поставками, точнее, с отсутствием
It
необходимых
has to
поставок
do
оружия,
with the
которые
lack
помогли бы
of
Украине одержать победу.
shipments of weaponry
Это оружие
to
есть.
Ukraine to win the
Более того,
war.
достаточно понятно,
But
что как
this military equipment exists,
для этого не требуется там самое современное оружие.
and Ukraine doesn't
Сегодня,
need
вчера
the
это
most modern
это оружие образцов
weapons.
70-х, 80-х годов, западное оружие,
The weapons
которое
the
американцы в
West
избытке,
has
и которое бы, безусловно,
and
если бы оно
Americans
было на поле
have
боя, давало те
excessively.
результаты, которые были
These are the weapons of
Но если мы подходим к
1970s
самому
and
главному,
1980s.
вот вы сказали слово
And
летаргическом сне.
here we get
Я
to
не
the
думаю,
most
что
important
летаргическом
point.
сне.
You
Проблема на
said
самом
that
деле
they
в том,
are
что в войне вы
lethargic,
должны сначала поставить
but they're
стратегическую
not.
цель.
First of all, in the war you need to
Понятно,
set
что для
a
Украины,
strategic goal,
вот,
and
для
clearly for
меня,
Ukraine,
для моих
for
коллег,
me,
для, в общем,
for my
я
colleagues,
думаю, большинства людей
and for
свободного
the
мира,
majority of the free world,
цель в этой войне это
the goal in
разгром
this
путинской
war
оккупационной армии
is to
и
defeat
освобождение
Putin's
Украины,
army,
всей украинской
to liberate
территории до
Ukraine,
Севастополя включительно.
all its territory,
Вопрос в том,
including
какие цели ставит
Sevastopol
перед
and
собой
Crimea.
Запад, ну и в первую
The
очередь
question
Соединенные
is
Штаты
what
Америки.
goals the West
И
has,
довольно совершенно
particularly the
очевидно,
United States. And in my
совершенно
view,
очевидно, что этой цели
it's
у
absolutely
администрации
clear
Байдена даже близко
that
нет.
this goal is
Более
not
того, я об
Biden's
этом
administration
писал, сейчас
agenda.
как раз
And
выходит
more
моя
than
новая
that, I
статья на
wrote
эту
about it,
тему.
and my upcoming
Администрация
article it will be
Байдена
about this
считает,
too.
что разгром
Biden's
путинской армии,
administration
который,
believes that
скорее
defeat
всего,
of the Putin's
привести к смене
army
режима в России,
will cause the
это большая
change of the
геополитическая
regime in
проблема.
Russia, and this is big
Значит,
geopolitical
пока
problem.
мы с вами разговариваем, там
While we're
продолжаются
talking,
переговоры, они
they
никогда не
still
прекращались между администрацией
have
Байдена, конкретно
negotiations
между директором ЦРУ
between
Бернсом
Biden's
и
administration,
помощником национальной безопасности Салливаном,
represented by
и
Burns and
путинскими
Sullivan,
там эмиссарами.
and
Речь
Putin's
идет,
emissaries.
как она давно всегда шла,
They are
о
talking,
фактическом
as they
лидере
talked
Украины.
before, about dividing
Это и
Ukraine.
есть цель
And this
администрации Байдена.
is the
И в
goal
этих
of
условиях,
Biden's
как
administration.
говорится, понятно, что
And
поставки
under this
оружия в том
condition,
масштабе, который необходим,
clearly,
они
the
противоречат
shipments
стратегической
of
цели.
weapons,
Как только мы начинаем
as they
понимать,
needed
что
by
цель
Ukraine,
Байдена никогда
is
не
not the
было
goal. And
предоставление
as soon as we
Украине всего
understand
оружия для
that the
победы,
goal of Biden's
ровно
administration
потому,
is
что эта
not to
победа
give
не
Ukraine
вписывается в
all weapons that
геополитический план
Ukraine
этой
needs,
американской
to win
администрации. Всё становится на
because
свои
it's
места.
not the goal of the
Вот
American
связано это в первую
policy,
очередь
so everything kind of gets in its place.
с тем, что скажем так, горе геополитики в Вашингтоне.
And all that has to do with the fact that so-called deplorable politicians in Washington, D.C., they look at the world in this Kissinger triangle, let's put it this way. Besides, everybody was talking about 100-year-old Kissinger who passed away, and they recall his legacy. Kissinger's concept of 1970s implied that in this triangle, Moscow, Washington, Beijing, America has to have the main ally against the main enemy. Now the concept has changed because the main enemy of this American administration is China, a strategic opponent. That's why defeat of the Putin Russia and potential destruction of the regime and collapse of the country will change geopolitical balance, and they consider it as negative. That's why they believe that it is necessary to hold negotiations with Moscow to find a proper variant. Of course, Ukraine shouldn't lose. They shouldn't let Putin win. But at the same time, they can't allow the total defeat and liberation of all territories. Sadly, this is a tragic reality of today. Because as soon as we begin to analyze actions of the American administration, even before the full-scale invasion, I had this big article back then, History of Treachery, and I used only open sources. Of course, I didn't have any inside information. Yes, I do have friends and colleagues that helped me to analyze this information, but the picture was clear that Ukraine was never, before the invasion, a key factor of the American policy. The administration intended to make agreements with all terrorist regimes and dictatorships, Iran and Iranian deal, absolutely crazy in 2015 and even more meaningless in 2021. Nevertheless, it was quite an important factor of American foreign policy. I mean, this nuclear deal. Now we can see how America is holding back Israel to totally destroy Hamas, and only because this is how the world is built in the eyes of this administration. And Ukraine was one of the factors. And Putin believed that if he's going to be quickly succeeding, then America will not do anything about it. America was expecting defeat of Kiev within 4 days, and then they would decide what part of Ukraine could be left as Ukraine, as dependent protectorate. But Ukrainian leadership did its best, and military and citizens of Ukraine, they disrupted all those plans. However, today we can see that history repeats itself. Another myth that should be destroyed. And this myth has to do with the fact that the American administration needs the money that Congress allocates for them for this support, and until the Congress does that, so there is a financial deficit to actually buy weapons for Ukraine. Well, this is a very dangerous myth. That doesn't take into account elementary realities of American internal domestic policy, and especially the financial element of this support. Of course, there is a package of financial support that is needed for Ukrainians to survive. The nuance here is that despite all the efforts of European countries, small European countries like Baltic countries, they do whatever they have. But they don't have enough weapons. But weapons of victory are in America, like in 1940s. This is the arsenal of democracy, and there are more than enough of these weapons. In the California desert, there are 2,500 tanks. Ukraine got only 31. More than 1,000 F-16, hundreds of ATACAMS missiles with the needed range and with enough explosives, plus big drones. What's important is that these weapons don't require special funding, because these are excessive weapons. So, and if there is political will, so they just sign the paper, write off these weapons and send them to Ukraine. More than that, many of these types of weapons, as a result, they must be destroyed because they need to free warehouses for new weapons, and it's cheaper to send these weapons to Ukraine than to spend money to recycle them. So This is a long and not a happy story, but sadly there are no any other explanations of the position of American administration that consciously doesn't give Ukraine the weapons that Ukraine needs. And it's not just Garry Kasparov who speaks about it. And of course, I'm not an expert in military, but listen to General Hodges or General Petraeus. American generals that speak about it, and they point out that there is no any serious military problem to isolate Russian troops in Crimea. The fact that the Crimea bridge is still there, besides, it doesn't require some super shipments of weapons. Americans have enough weapons that can destroy this bridge within a week. If they use big drones, they can do it within a couple of days. The railway through Melitopol could be cut very quickly too. And they won't be able to go on offensive because their supply lines will be destroyed. And why Americans don't supply the weapons that will destroy Russian logistics, and why it doesn't happen. And I have no doubt that Director of CIA Burns, former ambassador in Russia, he promised Patrushev and Narishkin that American weapons won't be used to attack the Crimea bridge. We are in the situation when, on the one hand, Americans can't let Ukraine lose, but on the other hand, they're afraid that Ukraine's victory will cause geopolitical consequences they can't cope with.
Гарри Кимович, ну вот я
Gary,
сейчас внимательно слушаю, конечно,
I'm
сказать, что
listening
я
to you very
расстроилась,
attentively,
ничего
and
не
to
сказать,
say
мне
that I'm very
сложно в это
upset is to
поверить,
say
действительно.
nothing, and
Почему?
it's very hard
Потому
for me to
что
believe.
президент Байден,
And why?
Америка,
Because
как
President
и
Biden,
Великобритания,
America, just like the
они
UK,
являются сегодня, ну, самыми
they are
большими
today
нашими союзниками,
our
партнерами, друзьями,
biggest
и, в
partners,
общем-то,
allies,
благодаря
and
их
friends,
помощи,
and
и
due to their
военной, и
help,
финансовой,
both
мы до сих
financial
пор
and military,
сражаемся, и мы
we're still
надеемся,
fighting,
и мы
and
знаем,
we
что нам
hope
нужна
and
победа,
know
и мы к этой
that we
победе
need the
идем.
victory,
Да,
and
тяжело,
we're
но
going to
идем.
this
Так
victory.
вот,
It's
даже
hard,
с
but
точки зрения
we do.
логики, вот объясните
But
мне,
even from the point of view of
разве
logic, could you explain it to
администрации
me?
Байдена, Соединенным
For
Штатам
Biden
Америки,
administration,
не
for the United
проще
States,
работать
don't you
с
think
не
it is
диктаторским
easier not to
преступным
work with
режимом
dictatorship,
Путина
criminal
против
regime of
Китая,
Putin
а
against
с
China,
них с помощью
but
Украины сегодня, не потратив
using
ни одного,
Ukraine
ни
without
жизни ни одного
losing
американского
any
солдата,
life of
просто
American
потратив, да,
soldiers,
деньги и
just
оружие,
spending money
сменить режим преступный Путина на
and
демократический
weapons
режим России,
to
тогда можно
change
спокойно,
criminal regime
нормально
of Putin
дружить против
for
Китая.
democratic regime and then be friends with them against China. First of all, let's separate the UK and the United States. The UK gives as much help as they can. They don't have enough weapons, and the weapons that are necessary for victory are in the United States. In Europe, they just setting up manufacturing, and America, they had those weapons even a year ago. And if the goal was a victory, when the Ukrainian offensive began in the summer of 2022, back then, even some small shipments of weapons would decide everything. So now, I repeat it again, it has been 2 years of full-scale war. Ukraine didn't get any planes, very little tanks. There are 2,500 tanks in the desert. They just stand there and do nothing. This is the reserve on Pentagon. The missiles that Ukraine gets, ATACAMS, they can't reach the bridge. There is a 20 kilometers gap, and even they don't have enough explosives to destroy the bridge. And it's purposely calculated. So what they do, they give enough support to Ukraine to hold the Russians. Of course, I would like to tell you some nice New Year fairy tales, but it's historical reality. So what would be easier? Of course, I agree with you. But for this, we need Reagan, Kennedy, Truman, but not administration of managers. Look at these people. Jake Sullivan, the person, in his biography, has only failures. Yeah, he's a talented and very capable man, but understands nothing in geopolitics. But he thinks that he can deal with global issues. Remember the reset. Jack Sullivan was one of the initiators of this reset. He worked with Hillary Clinton. The result of this reset after the attack on Georgia and Afghanistan, this is a shame that stained America for generations, and it's not even Vietnam. The war was lost there, and they had to leave. In Afghanistan, there was nothing to do at all. There were 75,000 bandits with Kalashnikov machine guns, and Americans just ran away from Afghanistan, fled Afghanistan. I think Putin decided that he can attack Ukraine after this footage, how Americans are fleeing Afghanistan. Now there are attempts to make agreements with Iran. Tomorrow there will be Venezuela, Maduro's regime, criminal regime. And they have two incomes. This is drugs and oil, two mafias that control the country. And Americans, and now of course it's American domestic policy, in order to indulge their green activists, American administration does not develop big oil resources there. So they're trying to make agreements with Venezuela. They say that they'll leave some sanctions and they'll need some political concessions. Maduro takes that, then he puts some of his oppositionists in prison, and then he says that he's going to take part of Guyana. All these dictatorships, they work in unison. The war that was waged by Hamas against Israel, it's clear that we can see Putin's fingerprints there. It's not only Iran who was doing this, and this is the result of the cowardly policy of America and people who can't take historical responsibility. Besides, I have to honestly tell you that there is no guarantee that Russia, after the defeat in Ukraine, Russia becomes a democratic country. There is a great probability of Russia's collapse, and that scares American politicians. You know, to make decisions of such historical magnitude, there must be different people. Just look at Joe Biden. And clearly he has to think about something else, not about foreign policy. Just look at how he looks, and he's incapable just to read teleprompter. The thing is that he spent 36 years of his life in Senate, and Senate is not a place where they make decisions. They make compromises, they're looking for some ways to move paperwork and what to do and how to do and all that. They don't make decisions. That's why senators have never been presidents. Obama became president. He was in Senate for 2 years, and he became president not because of the Senate. Kennedy came from Senate too, but he was in Senate only for 1 term. So a professional senator will never become a president. And as of today, we see the administration that, besides all the problems that I described, it is designed for domestic policy. Biden's administration, and it's more like a trend after Obama, America kind of leaves the world. Obama has this concept that America is guilty for everything and has to apologize to everyone, and we know the result. Trump had a different concept, but the same thing. He wanted to leave the global politics. Biden's administration now is more about domestic policy. Green agenda is very important for them. And foreign policy, when Biden was elected, foreign policy was never the main factor. And again, on the date of that horrible attack, 7th of October, Jake Sullivan's article was published in Foreign Affairs, where he was boasting how Americans resolved all problems in the Middle East. And this guy continues working. But they're very close to making a deal in the Middle East. Israel was very close to the deal. No, they were not. Listen, I don't know what we're close to. Just look at the results. People in business, they're fired for such results, and they can't be hired anywhere else. Sadly, in American politics, we have people who failed at everything. While we're talking, they continue hoping that they will be able to make agreements with Putin and to divide Ukraine. My article will be published in Wall Street Journal. I can't really prove that with documents, but everything I know and I can analyze tells us that the strategic goal of this administration is to freeze the conflict on the front line with the following decisions: to bring Ukraine as a member of NATO, and as a cherry on the cake and a New Year present, to confiscate some of Russian funds abroad to have money to restore Ukraine. This is the rosy dream of this administration, to make agreements with everybody. This is total nonsense. It cannot be, because Putin doesn't want that. And the problem is that American impotent policy brought us to the point when collective Putin realized that he can continue the war because sanctions doesn't work. So they already set up the supply channels of all the equipment Russia needs through the Central Asia. I don't know to believe numbers or not, but Russia produces drones, more drones than Ukraine, and Russia's military production works much better. Sanctions don't work, and we look at the whole picture, and the problem is that not that they lack some weapons or some element of sanctions. The problem is in setting goals. There is strategy. If the strategic goal is the victory, as Churchill and Roosevelt said in January of 1943, an unconditional surrender. It was on the 24th of February of 1943. The Stalingrad battle didn't finish yet. German troops were all over the place, and Japan was very strong. Italy was in the war. And they were saying back then, unconditional surrender. This is how you lead the war. And nobody from American administration can say these simple words, Ukraine must win. Instead of that, they have all these kind of words, these semi-formulations. We're going to help Ukraine as long as it takes. It's absolutely meaningless phrase and doesn't say anything. And sadly, this weakness brought us to the point when balance within the Putin administration, Putin's, not administration, this mafia state kind of shifted to those who are pro-war. And the war is beneficial for those who are in power in Russia, because the Russian economy works for war. They don't have the way back. 40% of Russian economy is dedicated to the war, and you can't kind of wind it back. The war has become the way of reproduction, political and economic. Okay, 6 months ago, in your interview to Dmitry Gordon, and I think you were one of the first people who said that Joe Biden will try to do his best so that Ukraine wins, America will help Ukraine win, and right before the election, presidential election of 2024, right in the summer, and that will help him to win the election. Do you think the same way today? I think that the probability is very small that Joe Biden will make it to the presidential elections. And I think all hopes of the Democrats that it's possible to choose a person who is unable to perform his functions today, and he has to stay in the presidential position for another year, and then for 4 years, I think that American voters will not understand this choice. And the problem is that the Democratic Party is paralyzed today and is moving to this electorate catastrophe. Joe Biden and all those who are around him, they're clinging to the power. Clearly, Joe Biden has to find a good successor for himself. The best thing that Joe Biden could do is to help Ukraine win and suggest Lloyd Austin as his successor. And I think it would be an ideal candidate and probably the best candidate in American administration. There is Blinken too, but Austin is probably the best one to tackle all American issues. But at the same time, we can see this attempt to create a new political discourse. That's why Trump remains the main factor in American policy, including foreign policy too. And the Democrats are thinking they will win on this contradiction.
внутриамериканский, со всеми этими уголовными делами,
Trump,
и
with
с его
all
внешней
his
политикой,
criminal
это просто
cases and
должны
foreign
людей толкнуть
policy and
Байдена.
all that, this
Проблема
is
в том,
something
что
Democrats think that
выбор
will
между Трампом и
swing people
Байденом,
to
он
Biden.
может просто
And choice
оказаться
between Trump
критическим
and
для
Biden
Америки,
can be
потому
critical
что
for America,
смешно смотреть. Это,
because it's
не
just
смешно, плохое слово. Это
ridiculous, probably
трагическая
ridiculous, not the
ситуация,
word. It's a tragic
когда
situation
будущее Америки, всего мира
when
определяется
the
между людьми,
future
которых
of
нельзя подпускать
America
сегодня уже.
is
Кажется,
determined
там
by the
принять решение
people
по разным
who
причинам.
can be
Вот,
allowed to
и
make decisions.
вот сейчас, мне кажется, многое в
Today,
американской внутренней
many
политике
things
будет
in
зависеть от
American
того,
domestic
сумеет ли Никки
policy
Хейли
will
стать
depend on
реальным
whether Nikki
оппонентом Трампа.
Haley can
Проблема в том, что
become a real
наличие
opponent
Байдена
to Trump.
убивает
The
ключевой
problem
аргумент.
is
Ну, я
that
сразу говорю Никки Хейли,
Biden's
потому что реальный
presence
шанс
kills the
у
main
них
argument. And when I say Nikki Haley, she has the real chance,
и
not
она набирает
DeSantis,
очки сегодня.
but Nikki Haley, and
Если
she's
бы
gaining
не
points.
проблема Байдена, я думаю,
If
что
we
она
didn't
бы
have
даже
problem
достаточно
of
уверенно
Biden,
выиграла, потому
then
что
she would
главный
confidently
аргумент
win.
это Трамп неизбираем. Он действительно, у него
The
там
key point
отрицательный
is
рейтинг в
that
Америке
Trump
55%.
is unelectable,
Проблема, что Байден
and
будет гораздо
his
выше.
negative rating is
То есть,
55% in the States. The problem is that Biden's negative
как
rating
бы
will be even bigger.
они нужны друг другу. Как
It
бы
seems like they
оба
need each other.
бессмысленны совершенно,
Both
но
of them
пока
are
они есть, как бы они
meaningless,
поддерживают друг друга. Вот такой
but
парадокс получается.
while they are,
И
they
поэтому
support
как
each
бы
other.
момент, когда
And
Байден,
there is
если
like this internal
отказывается
paradox. At the
баллотироваться,
point when
шансы
Biden
Трампа резко
decides not to run,
понижаются.
chances
Вот. И,
of
соответственно,
Trump
если
go
Никки
very
Хейли
low down.
добивается успеха на
Of course,
начальном
if
этапе
Nikki
праймериз,
Haley
что опять
succeeds
я
in the
бы
initial
как бы не
primaries,
гарантировал, но это такой шанс
I wouldn't
есть,
guarantee
и
though,
ее
but
акции
there is such a
с каждым
chance.
днем повышаются.
And
До
every
этого
day her
закрывать тему
shares are
Байдена, потому
growing.
что, скажем, там выборы
So
там
then
в следующем
Biden's
году
story will
там
be over
Хейли
because
против
the
Байдена, они
election
кончатся
in
для
next
демократов
year,
тотальным разгромом не
Biden
только на
versus
президентских
Haley,
выборах, но и на всех
and
остальных
Democrats will be
уровнях
totally
выборов.
destroyed, not
Ну,
only
потому
in the
что
presidential elections,
для
but also at all
нормального
levels.
американца
And
вот,
only
вот
because for an average American,
то, что сегодня делает
what the
демократическая
Democratic
партия,
Party does
вот
today,
попытка сохранить Байдена в том
an
виде, в котором
attempt
есть,
to
ну, люди
keep
же не идиоты,
Biden
они все это
as it
видят.
is,
Это, конечно, ну, по
people
большому
can
счету
see that. They're
ключ.
not idiots. It's really
Гарри
like slap in
Тимович,
the
вот
face.
Reuters на днях вышла со
Recently,
статьей о том,
Reuters
что
published an
Путин не
article
пойдет на
that
переговоры,
Putin is
на
not going to
заключение какого-то
negotiate
мира
and
до
to make
как
any
минимум
armistice,
выборов президента
at
США,
least
потому что он
until
очень
the
сильно
presidential
ждет
elections in
победы
the US,
Трампа.
because he
Но
is
вот если
waiting
вы
for Trump
говорите,
to
что
win.
Байден, он работает на
You
то,
say
чтобы
that
просто не
Biden
дать Украине проиграть, то,
does
в
everything so
принципе,
that
Трамп,
Ukraine wouldn't
даже
lose,
потому что мы слышим открыто в его
whereas
риторике, он,
Trump,
по
and what we hear
сути,
from his
за
rhetoric,
24 часа сдал
he's
бы
going
Украину
to
с
give up Ukraine
потрохами
for 24
Путину, что
hours.
вот закрыли вопрос, все хорошо.
He will give it to Putin,
Скажите,
and the matter is
пожалуйста,
settled.
то есть Путин считает, что у
So
Трампа
Putin
действительно
thinks that
есть
Trump
реальные шансы победить,
has a
и
real chance
если
to win,
так сложится, что
and if
Трамп придет опять к власти,
Trump
то
comes
чего
in power,
Украине ожидать тогда
what
от Трампа и
Ukraine is
от
supposed
Америки?
to expect from Trump and from the United
Ничего
States?
хорошего, в
Nothing good?
принципе. Но вопрос прихода Трампа к власти, он как бы
Yeah,
пока
but
все-таки
the matter of
является,
Trump's
ну, я бы не
coming
сказал
in power,
гипотетическим, но
I
это,
wouldn't say
это
hypothetical,
даже, я считаю, не 50 на 50.
but I
Это,
think it's
это
not even
президентские выборы.
50-50.
И я говорю
It's
о том, что
presidential
вот
elections.
сейчас пытался проанализировать
I
ситуацию,
try to analyze the
что
situation,
успешное выступление Никки Хейли
and successful presentation of Nikki Haley
на первых этапах
at the first
президентской
stages
гонки,
of
праймериз
presidential
может кардинально изменить
race
ситуацию. Да, вы
may
совершенно
critically
правы,
change the whole
сказав, что
situation. And you're
Путин
absolutely
считает,
right
что
when you
нет
say that
никакого резона сейчас
Putin,
заключать договор, потому
that
что
there is no
администрация
any
Байдена
reason
ничего не
to
делает, все равно
make
как
an
бы
agreement
угрозы
because
большие нет.
Biden's administration
Вот,
doesn't do
значит,
anything. There is
она
no
явно
big threat
боится
on that side,
победы
and it
Украины,
seems that
и поэтому
Biden's
мы подождем
administration is
Трампа.
afraid of
Ну, а посмотрим, что
Ukrainian
будет.
victory, and that's
Поторопиться.
why
Путин, в
it's worth
принципе,
waiting for Trump.
сегодня
Why
подошел
to
к
rush?
моменту, когда
Putin is at the
динамика
point
войны
when the
работает
dynamics
на
of the
него. Ну,
war
он может терять там
is working
3 к
for
1, а может
him.
даже 5 к
He
1
may lose
солдат.
like 3-1 or
Более того, в
5-1
принципе, Украина
soldiers.
теряет лучших своих
And
сынов и
besides,
дочерей, а Путин отправляет туда
Ukrainians
лоббистов.
send
И
their
вообще вот
best
идея
people, and
депрессивных
Putin
регионов. То
sends
есть с
to the
точки зрения
war
Путина как бы
criminals.
все пока нормально.
And from the
В
point of view of
человеческом
Putin, everything is
материале
kind
у
of
него
okay.
пока дефицита нету.
He still
Военная
doesn't have a
промышленность,
lack of
повторяю,
human
работает нормально.
resources.
А
And
главное, что он
again,
видит,
for
что
him, it's kind of
Америка
working
не
fine.
готова
And the main thing is that
пойти на
America is
кардинальные
not
меры.
ready
Даже
to
сегодня
do
вот
anything
война может быть выиграна просто поставками оружия,
critical.
которое в Америке
The
хранится.
war could
Нет
be
никакой
won
проблемы.
with the shipments of
F-16
weapons that
закроет
are just
тему
in storage in the
российских
United
вертолетов,
States.
которые
F-16
контролируют
will
линию
settle
фронта.
the
Мы
matter
знаем,
of
российские боевые
Russian
вертолеты просто
battle
не дают
helicopters.
танкам двигаться.
And we
Я в
know
16
that
снесли бы их вот
battle
сразу.
helicopters
Большие дроны
don't
уничтожат
let
мост. Ну,
tanks
понимаете, вот
move,
если бы
and
мост рухнул
big
сегодня,
drones will
то
destroy the
психологический
bridge.
эффект был бы невероятный.
F-16
Это
will
сделать 2
neutralize
недели,
those
без
helicopters.
всяких
This
проблем.
all can be done
Для
within
этого
2
нужна
weeks.
политическая воля, которой
For
нет.
this, we need
И Путин
political
это
will that
понимает, что
is
этой
not
воли
there.
нет.
And Putin understands that. It's very important to understand that Prigozhin's mutiny was an internal conflict within the Putin's administration. There were those who think that the war is not going anywhere. Prigozhin didn't have any problem with killing whomever, Ukrainians, Africans, but those in administration, they were suffering from sanctions, and it was all before Ukrainian counteroffensive, and we're afraid of this. So if the West gave Ukrainians just part of this necessary military equipment, Mariupol would be liberated today. And all of a sudden, turns out that it's not happening. So that's why balance has changed. And Prigozhin put at stake that the agreement is possible, and he lost. And Americans were afraid of this. Bill Burns was an ambassador in Moscow, and then he was deputy to the Secretary of State. And he's a person with experience of the Cold War, and for him, Moscow is kind of an axis of the world politics, and he can't even imagine there will be chaos in Russia. And this is a mistake that Bush the senior made back in 1990s when he had this speech and when he was saying, so don't submit to nationalists and, kind of keep the USSR intact. So in the United States, they're still kind of inheriting that concept. In chaos in Russia, this is unpredictable, Russia will be unpredictable, and China will be stronger. So, and if there are other solutions, they're more like half-measure solutions, and they're trying to freeze the war, and that would be actually quite beneficial for Putin. And actually, the war is spreading across the world. And as I said, the war in the Middle East, of course, this is a result of Putin's work, and Iran, and now Venezuela is on the run, and Taiwan. But I think Taiwan threat is a bit exaggerated. It's way too big of an operation. But Venezuela and Guyana, this is a problem. And clearly, Putin's regime and Ayatollah's regime in Iran, they can't retreat, they can't move back. This is a political reproduction of those regimes. They can't rewind it. Otherwise, all the ideological base is lost. More than that, Putin's economy is dedicated to the war. And they say themselves that 40% of the budget, in reality, is dedicated to the war. 33% officially, and there are many secret items in that budget, right? We're talking about total military economy, and if you look at the scale of militarization, they probably exceed the Soviet one, and this economy depends a lot on spare parts from the West, and this could be settled, but the problem is that there is no desire to have a clear concept to win in this war in the West. Because we can see that even those countries who have a consistent pro-Ukrainian position, like Estonia, Latvia, Finland, Poland, Canada, they still do business with Russia. And it happens because you can't prohibit business to do what they do, to get profit by trading with other countries. Look at what's going on in Kyrgyzstan. Their foreign trade is growing incredibly. It's like El Dorado. More than that, they ship not only dual-use technologies, so you don't need a washing machine to get a chip. Recently, Canada shipped their electric detonator for mines. They shipped it to Kyrgyzstan. Kazakhstan is buying gunpowder in industrial volumes, and we know where it goes next. They have been talking for a while about these third circle countries, the countries that help Russia to avoid sanctions. So they should be sanctioned too. We've been talking about it for months, for a year. See, it's very important to understand that there are two variants. So if you have a breach on two sides, you either have to punish Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Turkey, Armenia, Georgia. The list is long, and there is a simpler way to do that. You can settle this matter in your own country. There are companies that supply these technologies, and these companies, they're law-obedient participants of business projects in their countries. The problem is that there is no such a goal to stop them. Ambassadors of Western countries are in Moscow. They didn't even lower diplomatic relationship level with Russia. If you want to weaken Russian economy and to reduce Putin's ability to continue the war, it's very simple to do. You just determine on the legislation level in America, in Canada, in Germany, and Estonia that any sanctioned goods that are supplied to Russia through any third country will be immediately sanctioned. The company will be sanctioned, and then this company will be prosecuted. They need to have just a couple of lawsuits, and this import will be over. But they don't pass these laws. Germany is increasing its export to Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. It's just crazy numbers, tenfold. But there are no laws that would prohibit that. Pass the laws, and it's not that difficult. But the goal must be set. The war should be won, and Putin's economy should be strangled. Russia should be thrown into the Stone Age, and I spoke about it at the beginning of the full-scale invasion in March of 2022. All this can be done, but there must be a political will. Russian tankers with Russian oil go to the sea. Russia increases production of oil and gas, and they tell us about sanctions. Garry, you say that in the West, they don't have a clear mindset that Putin's regime should be destroyed. They have this mindset that Ukraine shouldn't lose, but at the same time, they don't have the mindset that Ukraine should win. But we, Ukrainians, we have this clear mindset that Ukraine will win, and Ukraine paid such a horrible price for this victory that we don't have any way back. Only forward and the victory. Given what you said and your analysis of the situation, you evaluated everything that's going on around the world. So your recipe, what shall we do today to win? You're not alone. In fact, everybody understands the price that Ukraine paid and is paying. Therefore, the position of the Western countries, and particularly the leadership of the United States, is absolutely immoral, and history will definitely punish it. And now Ukraine is suffering, and we can't see the end of this nightmare. Of course, I would like to believe that there will be enough resources, both material and human, to continue the war. But unfortunately, I have to say that many people in Washington, they believe that Ukraine will have to put up with the geopolitical reality. For me, any success of Putin is a catastrophe. Not in the scale of Ukraine, but it's a global catastrophe. Because any concession to dictator entails new wars, the same as a catastrophe in Afghanistan entailed Ukraine, then long war in Ukraine entailed the war in the Middle East. So I can only speak for myself. We do what we can, myself and my colleagues. several days
благодаря
ago,
усилиям нашей организации,
due to
которая
the
создала
efforts
в
of the
Америке,
organization that
Renew
I
Democracy Initiative, мы
founded in
организовали
America,
приезд
Renew
британских
Democracy
консерваторов во
Initiative,
главе
we
бывшим
organized
премьер-министром Лиз
the
Трасс
visit
в
of
Америку для
British
разговора с
conservatives
республиканскими
to
конгрессменами,
America
которые
to
выступали
talk to
против
Republican
помощи Украине.
congressmen that
На самом
who
деле, мне кажется,
voted
результаты
against
уже
the
есть,
support to
и
Ukraine.
пакет
And I
помощи
think the
Украине будет
results we
принят.
already have,
Мне
and the
кажется, здесь
package
сомнений нету,
of
что вот
support
эти
for Ukraine
сколько там,
will
60
be
лишних миллиардов, они примут.
approved.
Надо просто
About
понимать, что
$60 billion
там 61 миллиард вот этого
will be
военной помощи, из них
approved. And I
35
think
миллиардов идет в американскую экономику. Поэтому
31
понимать, что на
billion
самом
of
деле
this
эти
60
деньги
billion
это то,
goes
что
to the
платится
American economy.
американским военным
This is what
заводам
they pay to
за
American military
вот это
factories
для заполнения освободившихся складов.
for
Ровно поэтому это
refilling
на самом
the
деле
freed
не имеет
warehouses.
значения, потому что оборудование можно, вот это все военное, всю технологию
So
можно
all this
отправить. Да,
technology,
есть
all
проблемы
this
со
military
снарядами.
equipment should be
155
sent
миллиметров.
to Ukraine.
155
Of course, there is an
Но
issue with the
сами
155 millimeter
вот
shells,
как бы
but
вот эти образцы вооружений вот, в
these types
промышленных
of
масштабах,
weapons on the
они
industrial scale,
существуют.
they
Вот мы, значит, в
exist
принципе, ведем активную работу в
and
Вашингтоне
should be
для того, чтобы
used.
как
So we actively
двигать это
work
все в
in
правильную
Washington
сторону.
to
Пока, к
move this
сожалению,
whole
вот
thing to
мы
the
сталкиваемся
right
с тем,
direction.
что с этой
However,
администрацией, скорее всего, так же не сладится.
with this
Но
administration, it's very
впереди
difficult
выборы.
to do.
Значит, и вот есть надежда,
But the
что у
election is ahead of
республиканской
us, and there
партии
is hope
наконец
that in the
возобладает, в
Republican
общем-то,
Party,
нормальная
they
такая
finally
рейгановская,
have
рейгановская
this
линия.
normal Reagan's
Никакого другого совета
approach.
дать нельзя. Ну, мы
I can't really give
помогаем не
any other
только в
advice,
Вашингтоне.
and of course
Собираем
we
деньги,
help
то есть,
not
в принципе,
only in Washington, we raise
организация, которую
money.
вот я вот сказал, я
The organization
создавал,
that I
больше
said
10
I
миллионов
created,
долларов
we
гуманитарной
raised
помощи
more than
разнообразной
10,
отправим в
10
Украину.
million
И установки для чистой воды,
dollars of
еда, и спальники. То есть
humanitarian
там, на самом деле,
aid.
большая
We send
номенклатура
there sleeping
всего, что мы
bags,
делаем.
purification of
Вот,
water equipment, and many other things.
многие понимают, что
Many
происходит.
people
Но не
understand
надо
what's
забывать, что
going
уже
on,
вторая
but
война
don't
идет в
forget that
Израиле.
this is second
На
war is
самом деле,
going
эта
on
война
in
тоже
Israel,
требует
and
ресурсов.
this war
То есть, на
also
самом деле,
requires resources.
путинский режим вместе с иранским аятоллами
Putin's
растаскивает
regime, and
свободу мира,
together
потому
with
что трудно
regime
конструировать вторую войну.
Iranian
Здесь война.
ayatollahs,
Но, тем не
they are pulling the
менее,
world
сейчас,
apart.
мне кажется, появляется понимание того,
I
что
think that
это
right
одна
now
война.
they
Вот
begin to
сейчас
understand that this
там
is
задача
one
моих
war.
там коллег
My goal
зафиксировать
and
то,
the
что это
goal of
одна
my
война.
colleagues is
Что на
to
самом деле нет
communicate that
никакой
this is
разницы.
one war. There is no any
От
difference.
Днепра до
From the
Иордана
Dnieper
это
River to the
война
Jordan River, this war
силами
is a
власти,
war
диктаторами.
with the
И
forces of
что
evil, with
иранские мумии,
dictators, and
что
whether it's
бандиты из
Iranian
Хамаса, Хизбаллы, что путинский
leaders
режим,
or it's
это
Hezbollah or
все
Putin's
звенья одной
regime,
цепи. Но центр
these are
находится в
links of the
Москве.
same chain,
Вот
but the
источник
center is in
зла, вот этот вот
Moscow.
весь
The
мордор
source of
брать, вот этот
evil,
глаз
if
свободы,
we
это
say
Москва на
it's
самом деле.
mortar,
Надо понимать, что как
and
только
the
будет
eye of
ликвидирован
evil,
вот этот
this is
источник,
in
вот
Moscow.
этот,
So as soon as
который
we
генерирует зло по всему
destroy this
миру,
source that
ситуация начнет
generates
меняться.
evil all over
Но
the world, the
опять для этого
situation will be
требуется,
changing.
ну, я говорю, масштаб
But to
другой
do
совершенно.
that,
Вот,
there
вот
should be a
А вот
completely
давайте
different
я вас об
scale of
этом
effort.
спрошу.
Well, let me ask
Да.
you
Вот давайте я вас
about
об этом
this.
спрошу. Ну, давайте уже о хорошем немножко
Let's talk about
поговорим,
good stuff.
потому что надо какого-то позитива. Вот вы
We
сказали,
need
60
positive
миллиардов
things. You said
все-таки будут
60
проголосованы. То
billion
есть вот уже
will be
спасибо
voted
за эту
for.
новость.
Да.
Well,
Мы
thank you very
Да.
much
надеемся и
for this
ждем.
news. We hope for it.
Давайте еще, вот вы по поводу сказали источника
Also, you
зла,
said
и он
about the
сидит в
source of
Кремле,
evil,
реально.
and it's in the
Президент
Kremlin,
Зеленский
for
недавно в
real.
своем одном из
Recently,
интервью
the
сказал о
President
том, что
Zelensky, in one of his
Путин, военный
interviews,
преступник Путин, является
said
законной
that
военной
criminal
целью,
Putin
как реально
is
военный
a
преступник
legitimate
номер один в мире. Вот
military
как вы
target
считаете,
as a war
каким
criminal.
образом эта вообще история может
So
быть
what do you think?
реализована?
How this whole thing could be realized?
Ну, я не знаю, я не военный,
I
я
don't
не
know. I'm
знаю,
not a
какие
military
возможности в
expert.
плане
I don't
Украины.
know
Но совершенно
what
очевидно, что
capabilities
если
Ukraine
президент Зеленский
has.
является целью для Путина,
But
то
obviously, if
Путин
President
является целью
Zelensky is a
для
target
украинской
for Putin, then
армии,
Putin is a
разведки,
target for
если есть
Ukrainian
возможность
army
люди
intelligence,
тянутся.
and if
Никаких вопросов с
they
этим
can
нет. Другое дело, что я
get
полагаю,
him.
это маловероятно,
On the other
сильно
hand, I
маловероятно, к
think
сожалению.
it's hardly
Но
possible
очевидно, что
to
война,
get him.
с которой
But
столкнулась
what's
Украина,
obvious, the
война
war
на
that
выживание,
Ukraine is
она,
fighting,
мне
this is the
кажется,
war for survival.
допускает все методы
And I think this type of war
как бы, боевых
allows
действий,
to use
позволяющих
any
эту войну выиграть,
means
в том числе и
to
нанесение
win the
ударов по
war,
территории врага,
including
по военным объектам,
launching
при том, что мы
strikes
видим,
on
в
the
отличие
territory
от
of the enemy.
путинских атак
Besides what we see
на
comparing with
украинские
Putin's
объекты,
attacks on
гражданские
Ukrainian
объекты,
civil
пока
facilities.
что практически не
So
зафиксировано
far, Ukrainian attacks
жертв
almost
среди гражданского населения, но, скорее
don't
всего, есть
have
какие-то
casualties
случаи просто. Но
among civilians.
украинские атаки, вот, они носят
Ukrainian
точный характер, и
attacks,
это принципиальная разница.
they are
Кстати, опять, вот еще
precise
одна связь между
attacks. And this is another connection between the Ukrainian war and the war in Israel. A difference between bandits from Hamas. They don't just kill purposely Jews, but they also put their Palestinians under Israeli bombs. And Israel is trying to minimize casualties among civilians. And the same story we see in Ukraine. Bandits kill everybody, both the enemy and their own. Sadly, I have to say some unpleasant things. In the world, there is no this consensus that we need. Let's kind of stop talking about bad things, but the United Nations, I think it's a source of anti-Semitism, and in general, they generate the support of dictatorships. But a little bit of positive things. In fact, some changes are happening within the Russian immigration. If 2 years ago the situation was kind of in the air, now we can see that people cooperate with Ukraine more, and many people, those whom I represent, they do everything in their power to support Ukraine and military forces of Ukraine. A few days ago, we had this auction to raise money for Russian battalions in the Ukrainian army and Belarus battalion in the Ukrainian army. It's like $50,000. It seems like a small amount, but still, it's something that will help them. And we kind of pass that bridge, and psychologically we understand that we need to use all the methods to fight this evil regime. And the Free Russia Forum, we communicated at the end of the month that we said that we need to support all forms of fighting Putin's regime. And right now there must be decisive political steps in the West. And again, we're back to the painful points. The Western support, European and American, for different Russian organizations, it is directly linked to not changing the regime. As soon as there is any sign of changing the regime, those organizations are crossed out from all the lists. I'm not interested in this, but for many of my colleagues and supporters, this is a big issue. So Americans think that there are some organizations that want to change the regime, and those organizations are not in favor of those who provide support. About the regime, for a long time, they've been discussing this story about whether Putin died or not, whether he has doubles or not. The Sun published research of Japanese scientists based on AI, and they said that Putin has two doubles. So I don't believe in these conspiracy theories, but your subjective opinion. So what's going on with Putin? Does he have doubles? Why he physically so changed? Why he looks so freaky? Okay, let's make a reservation. We begin to speculate. How many planes, tanks, and rockets we can calculate it. How much money they raise, we can calculate it. We can analyze actions of American administration and the Europeans and the UK. But as soon as we're talking about secrets of the Byzantine court, we have to honestly admit that it's not a subjective opinion, it's pure speculation. Does Putin have doubles? I think it's obvious, he does. I think it's clear. That's just how the world of dictators is organized. This is a law of large numbers. Dictators always have doubles. More than that, there were certain moments when it was absolutely obvious. Just I could sense it. I don't need the computer technology for that. There was a double. I think the guy who went to Rostov in the headquarters of the army there, it wasn't Putin. Putin has something like a czar, this posture of a czar, something like that. And that person that was instead of him there, he wasn't quite acting it properly. He wasn't quite reaching the bar of the boss of the mafia. Whether Putin alive or not, it's very important that quite influential group in the Kremlin that is represented by Professor Solovey. And they said that Putin died. More than that, Professor Solovey is still alive. And I wish him good health and long life. But the fact that he's still talking means that this topic still exists. And by the way, we haven't seen Putin in action recently. His appearance at the Russian Church Congress, maybe yes, maybe not, it doesn't really matter in fact. Because what's obvious that today, if even you imagine it's not Putin or Patrushev, it's collective Putin, there are no any preconditions to finish the war. And because in this Russian mafia conglomerate, the party of war is dominating, and it's not only a matter of politics, but also a matter of economy. Russia is now on the military track, and it's important for the regime to survive. What are you waiting for from those beneficiaries of the war? You think they're going to change anything if they're going to benefit from it? So whether Putin exists or not, let them deal with that. We don't care. Right now, I don't see any prospects for the trend to change. I mean the war. Because as of today, this collective Putin doesn't see any real threat. Until Americans are ready to change their paradigm towards Ukraine, I think there won't be any changes in Moscow. Garry, we're close to the end of our interview, and here I would like to ask you this. Right before the week of the full-scale invasion, and you were guest of our show with Dmitry Gordon, and back then we were discussing the probability of full-scale invasion. And I honestly can tell you that I could not believe that it actually happens. And Biden was saying that, and Johnson was saying that, but we couldn't believe that. I remember your words, and you were saying that I don't believe that it's going to happen, that Putin will invade Ukraine, and your argument was it's illogical, it's not smart, and it's not beneficial for him. Did you analyze that situation after that, and why you made a mistake in your prediction? Well, actually, I was not saying exactly this. I was saying it differently. I didn't believe that because most probably it would bring the regime to its decline, and it's a mistake, and we see that actually now, and we had to get ready for that. And I was on the stream with Vlachenko after your stream, and in that interview I quite directly answered to one of the commentators who blamed me that I'm talking about the inevitable war. What should be clearly understood that this threat exists, and Putin's calculations are different from ours, because what we think it's war, huge losses and all that, their calculations are absolutely different. Our principal mistake is that we always trying to project a normal person mindset on those monsters. How this could have happened? Because they have a completely different calculation. We say why, but they say why not. So we'll conquer Kiev in 2 days, and everybody will agree with us. So the experience of communicating with the West actually convinced them they can do it. So if they can get away with it, if they do it quickly, they can get away with it. While Putin is in power for 24 years, he never actually encountered a true resistance. There is no Thatcher, there is no Reagan, there is no Churchill or Truman, no Roosevelt. We don't have leaders of this caliber, and this is a problem of Western civilization. And I think now it has to reconsider many principles of the recent decades. The West is right now at the point that the idea that after the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, the world is in a different phase, that this idea is not viable. These predictions of Fukuyama and the end of the history, everything kind of went completely differently. And the evil doesn't go anywhere. It can be buried under the rubble of the Berlin Wall. As soon as we lose our guard, it crawls out of this rubble So, right at the end of the Cold War, the total triumph of the free world, but now what we see, the many citizens of the free world, my American students, they don't understand that democracy, that's the only way of progress. They look at China and they're trying to find some sort of sympathy for Hamas or Bin Laden. Putin has quite a big support in the free world too. That tells us that we lost our benchmarks. Now the Ukrainian war and the continuation of this war in Israel and many more, this is the moment of truth for the whole humanity. That's why the victory of Ukraine, it is more than restoration of the integrity of Ukraine and restoration of historical justice. It's a chance for the whole free world to finally understand that there can be compromises with these vampires and killers. There are no any variants for that. Nothing will happen until they change regimes in Tehran and Moscow. And Moscow, of course, is the source. And this is what we need to strive for, and that's why all our activities and our work is directed to this. The organization that we created together with Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the Russian Committee of Action, Freedom for Ukraine and Victory of Ukraine, Freedom for Russia. And the victory of Ukraine is important so that the world begins to change. And maybe with our collective effort, we will be able to move the world history to the right direction. And in fact, in the West, many people repeat that and say it many times, that we pay with money and we pay with some of our efforts. Ukraine pays with people's lives and blood. And this is the debt that can be repaid by the humanity to Ukraine. And Ukraine now is resisting and being an avant-garde, resisting this evil, this fascism. What can I say? Glory to Ukraine. Glory to heroes. Gary, thank you very much for this difficult conversation. And I hope that in the West and in all democratic countries, there are more people who understand, just like we do, that Ukraine must win. And this victory includes everything that we've talked about. And you know, this conversation is important, but I want so that we finish our conversation on something positive. And it's not only because there is no so much time before New Year's and before Christmas, but could you say something that after our stream, our viewers would have a sense of hope and energy to continue our fight? 2 minutes ago, this what I said, the Ukrainian war and an incredible heroism of Ukrainians and their desire, and not even the desire, I wouldn't say that, I would say it's non-desire to submit to evil. I think this is the most powerful, energetic impulse that the free world receives today from Ukraine. I think today Ukraine is the nerve of the free world. Because everything kind of seems wrong and bad. And nevertheless, this heroic fight continues, and the West will be changing. In the history book, they will write that the changes in the West after the 30 years of this shame and retreat, those changes happened because Ukraine stood for itself and won in this war. Thank you very much. Thank you. That's great.